They thought they could bully their professor into quitting. They didn't expect him to fight back and win. Dr. Xavier Coleman adjusted his tie in the reflection of the faculty lounge window. The morning light cut through the glass, casting sharp lines across the empty room. It was his first day as a professor at Stanford Heights University, a place known for its prestige, legacy, and, as he had quickly learned, its unwritten rules. With a deep breath, he grabbed his leather briefcase and made his way to lecture hall B203. The moment he pushed the door open, the noise inside the room dropped, just enough to be noticeable. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward him, some curious, others indifferent. A few, assessing. He walked to the podium and set his laptop down. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Dr. Coleman, and this is your introduction to political theory." A few students exchanged looks. In the third row, a tall, blonde-haired student stretched back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. Blake Holloway. The name was already familiar. Son of a wealthy donor, captain of the debate team, a senior who thought he ran the place. Blake smirked. "Professor Coleman, huh? Thought you'd be, older." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Xavier met his gaze. "I'd say you'll get used to it, but this class isn't about me. It's about the material. So, let's begin." He clicked to the first slide. The laughter faded. The room settled into silence, at least for the moment. The first half of the lecture went smoothly. He laid out the syllabus, covered expectations, and began the first discussion on the origins of democracy. Most students followed along, nodding, taking notes. But then came the small disruptions. A whisper here, a stifled laugh there. Xavier glanced toward the back row. Blake and his group. Feet up on the seat in front of them, exchanging hushed remarks, barely pretending to listen. He ignored them. For now. "All right," Xavier said, closing his laptop. "Let's talk about Plato's Republic. How does Plato describe justice in an ideal society?" Silence. A few students shifted in their seats. Then, from the back, a voice. "Depends. Are we talking about actual justice, or just what people like to hear?" More chuckles. Blake again. Xavier leaned against the desk. "That's an interesting distinction. Are you suggesting people only believe in justice when it benefits them?" Blake's smirk faltered, but only for a second. He shrugged. "Just saying. Some people get the job before they earn it." The room tensed. The meaning was clear. Xavier's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Merit," Xavier said. "That's an old debate. Maybe one we should explore in next week's reading." Blake's smirk returned. But there was something in Xavier's tone that made him sit up just a little straighter. By the time class ended, students shuffled out, some giving Xavier polite nods, others avoiding eye contact. As he packed his things, a voice spoke from the doorway. "Dr. Coleman." He turned. A young woman stood there, clutching a notebook to her chest. Olivia Tran. "Yes? I just wanted to say, I thought the way you handled that was cool." He smiled. "Thanks, Olivia. See you next class." She nodded and left. Xavier exhaled, rolling his shoulders. It wasn't the first time he had been tested, and it wouldn't be the last. But something told him this was only the beginning. By the second week, the tension had thickened. It wasn't outright hostility, at least not yet. But the undercurrent of disrespect was impossible to ignore. It started subtly. Blake Holloway and his circle, 3 or 4 students who followed his lead, made sure their defiance was just quiet enough to avoid direct consequences. The first real incident came on Tuesday morning. Xavier walked into lecture hall B203, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other. Half the students were already seated, some flipping through their notes, others scrolling on their phones. He approached the podium, set his things down, and clicked open his laptop. His fingers froze on the keyboard. The slides had been tampered with. Instead of his carefully structured lecture on John Locke and the social contract, the screen displayed a photoshopped image of him, his face superimposed onto the body of a janitor holding a mop. Laughter erupted from the back row. Xavier's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to Blake, whose smirk deepened as he leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "Professor, is that today's lesson?" he asked, feigning curiosity. "Didn't realize we were covering workplace hierarchy." More laughter. For a split second, Xavier considered calling campus IT to trace whoever had accessed his slides, but he knew how this worked. If he made a scene, they'd turn it into a joke. Make him seem overdramatic. Weak. Instead, he took a deep breath, unplugged the projector, and turned back to the class. "Interesting choice of imagery," he said. "I hope whoever made this put half as much effort into their essay on Hobbes." The room fell silent. He tapped his laptop, and within seconds, his real slides reappeared on the screen. He turned back to the class as if nothing had happened. "Now, let's begin." Blake's smirk wavered. He hadn't expected Xavier to brush it off so easily. But that was only the beginning. By the end of the week, the pranks had escalated. His office door was covered in crude drawings, not outright offensive, but just enough to mock him. An anonymous email circulated through the student body, questioning his credentials. And then there was the classroom incident. It was Friday afternoon. Xavier was halfway through a discussion on the role of government in individual freedoms when it happened. Blake stretched and let out an exaggerated yawn. "Sorry, Professor. Just trying to stay awake." Xavier ignored it. But then another student did the same. Then another. Within seconds, half the back row was mocking him, yawning, stretching, shaking their heads like the lecture was unbearable. Xavier closed his laptop. Silence. He walked slowly around his desk, eyes scanning the room, before stopping in front of Blake. "You bored, Mr. Holloway?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Blake shrugged. "Just saying. Some professors know how to keep a class engaged." Xavier nodded. "That's fair. But let's test something." He turned to the rest of the students. "Anyone here who wants to leave, go ahead. Right now. No penalty." The room stilled. A few students exchanged glances. One girl shifted in her seat, as if contemplating it, but no one moved. Xavier looked back at Blake. "Looks like engagement isn't the issue, is it?" Blake's smirk slipped. Xavier turned and walked back to the podium. "Now, let's continue." The games were over, but the real fight hadn't even begun. By the third week, the situation had gone from petty games to outright sabotage. Xavier arrived at his office early Monday morning, ready to prepare for the day's lecture. As he reached for the doorknob, his hand stopped mid-air. The door was covered in red marker. Big, messy letters scrawled across the wood. "Fraud. Unqualified. Go back where you belong." Xavier's stomach tightened. He scanned the hallway. Empty. Whoever had done this had made sure to do it when no one was around. His hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to exhale slowly. He wasn't going to give them what they wanted. A reaction. Instead, he pulled out his phone and snapped a photo. 10 minutes later, campus security arrived. The officer, a stocky man with thinning hair, scratched his chin as he looked over the vandalism. "Probably just some dumb kids messing around," he said. "You want us to file a report?" Xavier studied the officer's face, indifferent. "Yes," he said. "And I want a copy of it for my records." The officer shrugged. "Sure thing, Professor." As he walked away, Xavier leaned against his desk, staring at the door. They wanted him out. That much was clear, but he wasn't going anywhere. That afternoon he stood in front of his class, ready for whatever they had planned next. The moment he began speaking, his laptop screen glitched. A loud, distorted voice blared through the speakers. "Imposter! Imposter! Imposter!" Laughter erupted from the back row. Blake sat there, arms crossed, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Xavier's jaw tightened. He unplugged the speakers, his face unreadable. "Whoever spent their weekend hacking my system, I hope they put the same effort into their research paper." The laughter faded. Blake sat up straighter, his smirk not as strong as it had been before. He had expected anger, maybe even humiliation. But Xavier was still standing, and that was starting to frustrate him. The final blow came Wednesday morning. Xavier was midway through grading papers when his phone buzzed. A new email. Subject: Urgent complaint. Dr. Xavier Coleman. His stomach dropped. He clicked it open and read, "Dear Dr. Wright, it has come to my attention that Dr. Xavier Coleman has been engaging in unprofessional behavior, showing clear bias towards certain students, and failing to maintain a fair academic environment. Several students have expressed concerns about his ability to conduct himself appropriately as a professor. We urge the administration to investigate these claims. The message was unsigned, but Xavier wasn't an idiot. He knew exactly who was behind it. Less than an hour later, he sat across from Dr. Ellen Wright, the department head. She tapped a pen against her desk as she skimmed the complaint. "These are serious accusations," she said finally. Xavier folded his hands. "And they're completely false." Dr. Wright sighed, setting the paper down. "I believe you, Xavier, but things like this, they don't just disappear." His pulse pounded in his ears. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to be smart about this." She leaned forward. "If someone wants you gone, they're not going to stop here. Be ready." Xavier sat back, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. He had two choices: back down or fight back. He chose the second. But he had no idea just how far things were about to go. By Friday, Xavier thought he had prepared for anything. The vandalism, the emails, the classroom antics, he had handled it all, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. That afternoon he walked across campus, lost in thought, his mind racing through ways to get ahead of the situation. That's when he noticed the snickering. Two students passed him near the library, one nudging the other with a barely concealed grin. Another group near the quad glanced at him, whispering behind their hands. Something was wrong. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Olivia Tran. "Dr. Coleman, have you seen this?" His chest tightened. He clicked the link she sent. A YouTube video. The title made his stomach drop. "Professor Coleman can't handle his own class." His thumb hovered over the play button. He inhaled sharply, then pressed it. The video started with low-quality phone footage taken from the back of his lecture hall. It showed the speaker hack incident, where the distorted voice had blared "imposter" through the room. The camera zoomed in on his face, catching the exact moment his expression shifted. Then, an edit. A slow-motion effect made his reaction look exaggerated, like he was breaking under pressure. Over it, text in bold red letters. "Weak. Pathetic." The next clip was from earlier in the semester, his first encounter with Blake. But the audio had been altered. In the clip, it sounded like Xavier had stumbled over his words, hesitated too long before answering. The caption, "Doesn't even know what he's talking about." The final section showed the yawning stunt, students mocking him. Except the edit made it seem like the entire class had turned against him. At the bottom of the screen, a poll. Should he be fired? The votes weren't in his favor. Xavier's jaw clenched. His hands shook, not with fear, but with something heavier. Rage. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was an attack. A calculated attempt to ruin him. He walked straight to his office and locked the door. He needed to think. This wasn't a fight he could win in private. Blake and his group had made this public, so that's exactly where he needed to take it. For the first time in days, a small smile pulled at the corner of his lips. If they wanted to play dirty, he'd show them what a real counterattack looked like. That night, he made a video of his own. Not an angry rant, not a defensive speech. No begging, no pleading. Instead, he laid out the facts. First, he showed the original, unedited clips. The real footage. No manipulations, no slow motion, no distorted audio. The yawning stunt? Just a few students, not the whole class. The speaker hack? A targeted prank. Then he showed screenshots. The vandalized office door, the fake emails, the complaint filed against him. He didn't speculate. He didn't call names. He just let the evidence speak for itself. Finally, he added one last message. This is what happens when you challenge the system. Some people will do anything to keep you out. But respect isn't given, it's earned. Let's talk about that. Then, with one click, he uploaded it. And by morning, everything had changed. Xavier barely slept that night. He knew his video had to make an impact, but whether people would actually care, that was another story. By morning, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. He reached for it with a tight chest and tapped the screen. His video, posted barely 10 hours ago, had already hit 250,000 views. His inbox was flooded. Some messages were supportive. Students from different universities sharing their own stories of bias and harassment. Others were nasty, accusing him of playing the victim, of being too weak to handle a little banter. But one email stood out. Subject: urgent. University response required. It was from Dr. Ellen Wright. Xavier, please come to my office immediately. We have a situation. By the time Xavier walked across campus, the energy in the air had shifted. He wasn't imagining it. People were looking at him differently. Some students avoided eye contact, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Others nodded, gave him a tight-lipped smile, like they weren't sure whether to apologize or congratulate him. And then, there were the ones who wouldn't look away. Blake Holloway stood near the entrance to the admin building, arms crossed. His usual smirk was gone. He wasn't laughing anymore. Xavier didn't stop. He pushed open Dr. Wright's office door without knocking. She sat at her desk, phone in hand, stress written across her face. "Shut the door," she said. He did. She exhaled. "Your video is everywhere." "I know." She pinched the bridge of her nose. The university board wants this handled quietly. But Xavier, this isn't just an internal issue anymore. Journalists are calling. He blinked. Journalists? Yes, your story hit Twitter last night. There's already a hashtag. She turned her monitor around. Xavier stared at the screen. Stand with Coleman. It wasn't just students talking anymore. It was alumni, parents, even faculty from other universities. "They're calling for an investigation," Dr. Wright continued. "Not just into your situation, but into the culture at this university." Xavier's heart pounded. He hadn't expected this. He had just wanted to protect himself, to clear his name. But now, it was bigger than him. Dr. Wright leaned forward. "The administration has no choice but to act. There will be a meeting, official disciplinary hearings." Xavier folded his arms. "For who?" Her lips pressed together. "For the students involved." By lunchtime, the university had released a statement. It was carefully worded, a lot of corporate talk about reviewing concerns and upholding campus integrity, but the important part was tucked in the middle. A formal inquiry will be launched into reports of misconduct within the student body. For the first time since this all started, Xavier felt the ground shift beneath his feet, but in his favor. But he knew this wasn't over, because Blake Holloway wasn't the type to go down without a fight. The university's announcement sent shockwaves across campus. Students whispered in hallways, emails flooded faculty inboxes, and social media erupted. But no one was louder than Blake Holloway. By mid-afternoon, Xavier's phone buzzed with a text from Olivia Tran. "They're waiting for you outside the student center. Be careful." Xavier didn't need to ask who they were. When he stepped onto the quad, a crowd had already formed. Students, some holding their phones up, others murmuring among themselves. And in the middle of it, standing tall with his arms crossed, was Blake. His usual arrogance had sharpened into something nastier. Xavier met his gaze, expression unreadable. "Something you need, Mr. Holloway?" Blake let out a mocking laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, so now you want to act like the big man." Xavier didn't respond. He let the silence stretch. Blake's smirk wavered, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. "You're a joke, you know that? A bunch of nobodies online think you're some hero, but we all know the truth. You're just another professor who can't handle a little criticism." Xavier studied him for a moment. "Criticism?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Is that what you call hacking my slides? Vandalizing my office? Filing a false complaint against me?" Blake scoffed. "Oh, come on. You really think anyone believes that? You're just playing the victim because you know you don't belong here." The crowd murmured, some in agreement, some shifting uncomfortably. Xavier exhaled slowly. Then in a voice measured and steady, he asked, "Blake, tell me something. Do you know why this has escalated the way it has?" Blake frowned. "What? Why this isn't just some private disagreement anymore? Why people are talking about this across the country?" Blake rolled his eyes. "Because you made a spectacle out of nothing." Xavier shook his head. "No. It's because people recognize what's happening, and they know it's bigger than just you and me." The crowd stilled. Xavier took a step closer, voice still even but firm. "You thought you could humiliate me. That if you pushed hard enough, I'd break. That I'd pack up and leave quietly." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I didn't. And now, you don't know what to do." Blake's face twitched. His fists clenched at his sides. "You—" Xavier held up a hand. "Let me give you some advice, Blake." His voice dropped slightly, measured but piercing. "You can throw a tantrum. You can whine about how unfair this is. But at the end of the day, the truth is out. And when the truth is out, people pay attention." Blake's smirk was completely gone now, and for the first time he looked afraid. The crowd murmured again, but this time the shift was clear. Some students who had laughed at Xavier just a week ago now looked at Blake with something closer to disgust. Blake opened his mouth to say something, to throw one last insult, one last jab, but then he hesitated, because he knew he had lost. Xavier gave him one last look. "I suggest you start thinking about the future, Blake. Because this moment, it's not going away." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, and this time no one laughed. By Monday morning, the final nail was in the coffin. The university sent out a formal statement confirming that a disciplinary committee had been convened. They didn't name names, but everyone knew exactly who was under investigation. Blake Holloway and his group. Xavier sat in his office, scrolling through emails. The messages had shifted. No longer just support from strangers, but students. Some he had never even spoken to. Apologizing. "Dr. Coleman, I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. I was in your class last year. I saw what they did to you. I didn't do anything. And now I regret it. I never realized how much power some students think they have over professors. Thank you for standing up for yourself." Xavier leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had won. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like proof. Proof of how many people had been watching, silently, uncomfortably, afraid to take a side until it became too big to ignore. There would be meetings, hearings. Blake's father would probably pull every string possible to protect his son, but the damage had already been done. Blake Holloway's name was tarnished, and more importantly, so was his power. That afternoon, Xavier walked into Lecture Hall B203. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension, no whispering, just students waiting for class to begin. He set his laptop down and surveyed the room. A few students gave him nods of acknowledgement. Olivia sat near the front, notebook open, ready. Even some of the students who had once mocked him now sat quietly, their faces unreadable. Xavier cleared his throat. "All right," he said. "Let's get back to learning." And this time, everyone listened. Respect isn't given. It's earned. But sometimes it's taken for granted. People abuse power because they think no one will ever push back. But when you stand your ground, when you refuse to be intimidated, something incredible happens. People wake up. So what would you have done in Xavier's place? Would you have fought back or walked away? Let me know in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. See you next time.